The stat Dexterity. We don't level it up, and if we did, we don't talk about it. But jokes aside, the age-old question has always been whether strength or dexterity is the better one, and it kind of does differ from game to game. I'll probably end up making a separate video about that, but for today we are going to go over the best dexterity weapon for every single Souls game, and we are going to include Bloodborne onto this list too. Now when I say dexterity weapon, I mean that the weapon scales best off the dexterity stat, so it's not necessarily going to be the weapons that are just really fast, which typically dexterity does fall under that category anyway, and obviously the strength weapons will tend to be a bit slower. But speaking of which, something I would like to know is what's your guys' favorite dexterity weapon category? Whether it be katanas, curved swords, thrusting swords, claws. Definitely do let me know what your favorite one is down in the comments below. But yeah, let's get into it, and as always, keep in mind it is just for PvE. The dexterity weapons in Demon Souls tend to be really powerful because they tend to output the highest DPS, and a lot of enemies didn't really have any poise, and there wasn't really much of a stagger system like there was in the later games. So I would actually argue that this game kind of catered a bit more towards quicker types of weapons. And there are lots of really good options out there, but I think the best dexterity weapon in the game would go to the Killage, because the Killage is the best curve sword in the game just based on damage. And if you don't know, all weapons inside of their own category get the exact same moveset, so every single curve sword just gets the same moveset. But the curve sword moveset itself is extremely powerful. They're like almost just as fast as daggers, but just get more range and just more lunge, which daggers themselves are actually really good in this game. So in my opinion, I think the curve swords are probably the best class in the entire game when it does come to ease of use and just damage. And the Killage does stand alone as the best one in my opinion. I think straight swords might end up being like a close second when it does come to the best weapon categories in this game. But funnily enough, I think the best straight swords in these games aren't even the ones that scale off dexterity. Except for the penetrating sword, I think this one is probably the best dexterity options for the straight swords. Another weapon that was pretty close to getting number one in the dexterity list would be the hiltless katana, which katanas I kind of see as like a slightly worse version of curved swords, as it just don't really output as much DPS, nor really have as good as a lunging attack in terms of its moveset. But one thing katanas tend to do better would be like its variation in moveset, as it do get things for like poking attacks, horizontal swipes, and vertical swipes. So if you did find the curved sword moveset a bit too boring, then I would go for the hiltless katana, but do keep in mind that this one actually does drain your health for every single hit. Now, when it does come to the best dexterity options in Dark Souls 1, it is going to be kind of similar to Demon Souls in that the katanas and the curved swords will be like the best options. And honestly, a lot of weapons in those categories can be amazing. Like literally any single katana could end up being the best katana. They're all that good. And kind of the same thing can be said about the curved swords. The Painted Guardian curved sword is like the highest DPS in the game, and it can be infused. Also gets passive bleed. The trade-off is that it does get pretty poor range. So if you didn't like the range, then I would go with a falchion. But as good as those weapons tend to be, funnily enough, the best dexterity options in my opinion won't even be in these categories. And it came down to the Boulder Side Sword, which is a straight sword that gets an amazing moveset, and the Great Scythe, which I'm just going to go with the Great Scythe because I think not only is this the best dexterity weapon, but probably the best weapon in the entire game. Now, Scythes or Reapers weren't actually under their own weapon category back then. They still fell under Halberds, and Halberds in Dark Souls 1 are just incredible, due to them getting amazing range, relatively quick movesets, but amazing damage and stagger potential too. And for the Great Scythe in particular, this thing is incredibly light, gets some of the most range, really low requirements, you get it right at the beginning of the game, gets passive bleed, ridiculous damage, and an amazing moveset. The light attacks are really quick downward slams, the heavy attack is a really solid horizontal swipe that can hit multiple enemies and lunge in really far. The running attack also works very similar, and it just gets a really good dexterity scaling. The Life Hunt Scythe can also be just as good as well, and against some bosses it might end up being a bit better due to its better bleed damage, but the Great Scythe just gets more range, it's lighter, and it just gets more damage too. So yeah, I think this thing is just broken personally. The best Dark Souls 2 dexterity weapon could go to any single piercing sword or rapier because they're all just that good. And it's probably the only Souls game to where the piercing swords are the best dexterity option, because typically curved swords or katanas will just end up doing better. But unfortunately, they aren't really that good. The curved swords just tend to be outclassed by the katanas because the katanas get very similar speeds, damage, but just have more range and better variation of movesets and just much more counter damage. So they'll end up just being a bit outclassed unless it does come to the warped sword, because for whatever reason, this thing gets amazing counter damage and really good poise damage too. And when it does come to the katanas, the Chaos Bladers is probably going to be the best one, because that one just also gets ridiculous counter damage, but it also just hits the hardest out of all the other katanas. But unfortunately, it does have the trade-off of damaging the player character for every single hit. So if you actually didn't like to have piercing swords because you thought like the whole poking attack moveset was like really boring, then I would go with one of these two options. But when it just comes to straight up just DPS potential, ease of use, low stamina cost, really low requirements, low weight, the piercing swords are just broken. Now, the rapiers tend to be the best amongst them because it all gets really high counter damage, like roughly 140 counter damage. And when paired alongside things like the Leer Ring, because yeah, these things are all doing thrusting damage too, you can get insane amounts of damage output. Now, when it does come to the best rapier, I do think the Ice Rapier is the best one. However, this is the best Dexterity weapons video. And the Ice Rapier is the best one for elemental builds, but when it does come to a Dexterity build, it's not going to get as much damage as some of the other options, but it still might end up being the best due to its really good heavy attack as it serves as a projectile. But the Rapier, Ricard's Rapier, and the Espada Repairer can actually all out damage it. The regular Rapier is going to be like your best early game option until you actually do gain access to the Espada Repairer. But I want to talk about the Ricard's Rapier. I think the Ricard's Rapier is the best Dexterity weapon in this game because it does get some of the most damage with a pure Dexterity build. Also gets that same counter damage, also is really light with low requirements, but it gets an insanely quick heavy attack that can just output ridiculous amounts of damage. It's going to be a lot better in terms of like burst DPS due to its like very large stamina cost, but it also can proc poison in just that one heavy attack combo when you do have the weapon poison infused, which it somehow still retains an S scaling in Dexterity with a poison infusion and almost every other infusion too. But it is extremely powerful because its power sense heavy attacks can also output a lot of damage and not even really consume much stamina also for some reason. So you can really go any which way when it does come to the piercing swords in Dark Souls 2. But when it does come to pure Dexterity builds, I think the Ricard's Rapier is the best one. Dexterity in Dark Souls 3 is probably the best damaging stat, not only because that the faster weapons tend to be more preferred, due to like a lot of enemies not really having any poise, like they just easily get stun locked by a dagger. Also the fast paced nature of the game, and the fact that the stance breaking mechanic wasn't fully fleshed out in Dark Souls 3 like it is for Elden Ring. So it kind of just makes quicker weapons be preferred in that game. But another reason why Dexterity is so good is because of how the scalings actually work in Dark Souls 3. For some reason, the sharp infusion just ends up outperforming the heavy infusion 9 times out of 10. And it's to the point that like the Claymore or the Lothric Knight Ultra Greatsword, these weapons actually scale better off Dexterity than they actually would Strength. So when it comes to the best Dexterity weapon in Dark Souls 3, it's pretty much like saying what's the best weapon. And it's obviously going to be the Sellsword Twin Blades, but you can literally pick any infusible curved sword or any infusible straight sword, make it sharp infused, and just instantly have one of the best weapons. Because these weapon categories are extremely light, really quick, low stamina cost, have nice horizontal swipes, which is really good for all the ganks in this game. And as I mentioned earlier, no enemies really have any poise, so they can easily be stun locked. And these are just the best R1 spamming tools and the best at stun locking. But the reason why the Sellsword Twin Blades is the best one is because it's a paired weapon, and paired weapons in Dark Souls 3 are just broken because it has output much higher DPS than almost anything else. Like you're literally swinging with 2 separate weapons at the exact same time, and it's very similar speeds. So when it comes to its ease of use, DPS, stun lock potential, even as pretty useful weapon skill as well, it just makes the Sellsword Twin Blades the best ones. There isn't any Dexterity stat in Bloodborne, but there is a skill stat, which is pretty much the exact same thing, so might as well include it onto the list. And this stat is also extremely powerful and potentially the best damaging stat too, and it's purely because that your visceral attack damage scales off the skill stat for some stupid reason. But when it does come to the weapon themselves, it came down to 3 separate ones. And that was the Beast Hunter Scythe, the Church Pick, and the Rakuyo, which funnily enough, those 3 are DLC weapons. And it just continues the trend that the DLC just ends up having much better stuff than the base game. If I were to pick the best skill weapon specifically for the base game, it would probably be between either the Burial Blade or the Blades of Mercy. I don't really consider either of those to be the best, and that's mainly because that you can't buff them. Also, the Sword Speed does scale better off skill than it does do in strength, but the thing is, it's not that much better, and I kind of see it as more of a quality-based weapon. And I'm probably going to make a separate video talking about quality weapons, but if I actually were to classify this weapon as a skill-based weapon, then it honestly would get number 1. But my pick is going to go to the Rakuyo. Not only is this weapon incredibly fun, but it has some of the most insane combos. Doesn't matter whether it's transformed or not, whether you're using the light attacks, heavy attacks, or the L2s, every single one of them can just be really good. I do just like to have it transformed and use those L2 attacks, because this combo can output a lot of damage and stun lock really nicely. But it just does so many things really well. You can have like a really hard hitting option in just one big hit. You have that stun lock potential. It can be buffed. Like the only downsides that I can say about the Rakuyo is that you get it right at the end of the DLC of some of the most annoying enemies in the entire game. But it doesn't really change that I consider this thing to be the best skill option. When it does come to the best Dexterity weapon in Elden Ring, it definitely is a lot more interesting to try and think about compared to the other games. And it's mainly because that Elden Ring does have a lot more balance between every single damaging stat and not just have all the weapons be tied to the strength or dexterity builds. And in fact, it's actually the only game where the elemental damaging stats tend to just be the better ones, because all the faith, intelligence, arcane types of weapons can just be really broken with all those insane types of weapon skills. I think it's definitely one of the best things that Elden Ring did do when it does come to its build creation, is having every single stat feel really powerful and not have like one that's particularly better than the other. Strength-based builds have that really good stance breaking potential. Dexterity builds tend to have some of the highest DPS potential with things like power sensing combos and the multi-hit talismans. But when it does come to the best dexterity weapon, it was definitely kind of hard to pick, but I settled on picking the Nagakiba, which I consider this to be the best katana in the entire game, and it definitely performs best with a dexterity build too. Now I think this is the only game alongside Dark Souls 2 to where I consider the katanas to be better than the curved swords, but the curved swords will be better when you do have them power stance. And the funny thing is I do consider the power stance and curved sword build to be better than katanas no matter what, but I think the best power stance and curved sword build will be like the occult scavengers, which is not really a dexterity build at that point, it's kind of more arcane. But curved swords and katanas aside, I think the claws are the most complete dexterity type in this entire game. They offer some of the highest DPS with their really fast movesets, get passive bleed, 110 crit, you can just two-hand them to gain the power stancing combo, and with things like Blood Flame Blade or any weapon buff, it actually applies it onto both hands, which can make the damage be even higher. But the only reason why I didn't put the claws or the raptor talons specifically over the Nagakiba is because I don't really think it's as beginner friendly, due to the poor range, the fact that you have to have it two-handed so you can't really use a shield, and it also lacks the stagger and stance damaging potential that the katanas have. And there are some other weapons out there like the Bloodhound's Fang that can perform really well with a dexterity build, but that one's kind of a bit more quality as it does have a pretty good strength scaling too. The Bolt of Grandsax is another weapon that could have potentially ended up getting number 1, and it maybe could have with the base game, but since the DLC releasing, the Bolt of Grandsax didn't really receive any buffs, whereas like the Nagakiba and Bleed builds actually did. So when it does just come to a pure dexterity build through and through, I think nothing can really perform better than the Nagakiba, because katanas get extremely quick movesets, really good range. The Nagakiba in particular gets like broken types of range. Like I don't know how it ends up getting twice as much as almost any other weapon, while the damage difference is really not that great. While it also gets the best movesets as well, because both one-handed and two-handed heavy attacks is nothing but pokes. And because they have such a nice variation in moveset, they also get plenty of weapon skill options too. The best one being Unsheath. This skill is just completely broken. It's really fast, it outputs high amounts of stance damage, it's incredibly cheap, and with things like the Shard of Alexander and now the Rolana's cameo, it can cheese basically every single enemy in the entire game. And probably best of all yet, these weapons come with passive bleed, and bleed in this game is just broken because you can proc it really quickly. A lot of enemies are weaker to it. There are lots of buffs that you can pair alongside with this, and with a dexterity build, you can still have it buffed, and with Blood Flame Blade stacked on top of it, you can proc bleed just as fast as you could with like an arcane build, which is just ridiculous. Sometimes even more so because Blood Flame Blade completely bypasses motion value status effect buildup, and when paired alongside skills like Double Slash, it can just be amazing. Okay, that's now done and completed. As always, let me know what your opinions are down in the comments below. In terms of the next video, it's probably going to be ranking the Soulsborne daggers, because I actually am in the middle of a marathon, which if you are interested, definitely follow me on Twitch, because I'm live there every single day playing a bunch of Souls games, doing all these challenge runs and whatnot. And then after that, I'll probably continue making videos like this, but for strength, faith, and intelligence as well. So definitely do subscribe for that. And I'll catch you guys around. Bye.